Thanks very much for inviting me. When you're introduced as Sir Paul Collier, foreign world expert, it's always, I'm typecast as a member of the metropolitan elite. I've got more letters after my name than in my name. I didn't start like that. And so just let me reassure you that I'm a normal human being, right? I grew up, I didn't grow up anywhere fancy like Oxford. I grew up in Sheffield. Many of you will know what happened to Sheffield. You just don't remember it's Sheffield. Many of you will have seen the film, The Full Monty, about a city getting smashed by globalization. That's my city, right? That's my next-door neighbors. That's my family. I lived through that, right? I've got all this education. I've got more education than, almost anybody else. Both my parents left school when they were 12. Right? So I'm a first-generation metropolitan elite, but my heart and my experience is in a very different world. Right? It's with people who knew that they were marginal and who got smashed by a devastating economic shock. Right? What made me, what took me out of that world into the world I'm in now was actually social democracy. But it was a different period of social democracy. It was the triumph of social democracy around Europe, which happened between about 1945 and 1970. And the ethical origins of that triumph, which built the health systems, the educational systems, and such like, which transformed my life and many others, the ethical origins of that, I think, were in the practical responses of ordinary people to the anxieties they faced in cities like Sheffield back in the late 19th century. And what people responded with was the cooperative movement. And the cooperative movement built very practical cooperative solutions of reciprocal obligations, shared insurance, shared savings, a whole mass of cooperative activities, initially at the local level, which then, 1945, scaled to the national level and built these transformed societies, which opened opportunities. That was a magnificent achievement, and at its heart, that is, I think, communitarianism, which then created this fabulous success of social democracy. And more recently, I think social democracy has lost its way. I say that about 6 weeks ago, I gave the opening address at all the European parties of social democracy joined together for an annual conference in Brussels, and I was invited to open that. And so what I'm going to say for the next 5 minutes is a quick summary of that, right? That I think social democracy got sort of hijacked by kind of people who are educationally like me. They're the metropolitan, highly educated. And what they picked up, but they were detached from the origins that I experienced. They were 2 or 3 generations removed from that. And what they navigated by was not communitarianism, reciprocal obligations. They navigated by utilitarianism, global utilitarianism. I've come to believe that global utilitarianism is a disastrously unethical philosophy. It is weird. It was invented by a guy called Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was not a saint, he was a nutcase. Literally, we now think he was autistic. Right? And then he had one disciple called John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill was again not a saint. John Stuart Mill was raised deliberately isolating him from all other children. Instead, he was taught classical Greek so that by the age of 8, he was reading Plato's Republic in Greek. Right? And so he grew up to believe in Plato. And what's Plato's great idea? Utopia is to be run by a bunch of guardians, Platonic guardians. And Plato made one silly mistake. He thought that the Platonic guardians should be professors of philosophy. And fortunately, people like me have improved on that. We show, no, we've got to be professors of economics. And so for the last 30 years, our societies have basically been run by utilitarian economists who believe that people are economic man, we're greedy and selfish. That's the economist view of people. It's a complete travesty of what people are really like, but unfortunately, students who study economics do indeed become greedier and more selfish. Right? Economics is very good at causal analysis now, and we can prove that. Right? We're not even ashamed of it. So for the last 30 years, we've had this peculiar moral world in which the paternalist state is run by these saintly utilitarians who are going to maximize global utility, and they can do what they want because you can't trust ordinary people to be moral actors. Ordinary people are just greedy and selfish. Right? So we've moved 1,000,000 miles from where social democracy started, which was the morality of ordinary people building reciprocal obligations that then achieved wonderful things. Right? And so, almost without recognizing what's happened, that is what happened to social democracy. Instead of an ethical society building an ethical state, we've got an ethical state trying to impose an ethical society on people who are assumed to be greedy and selfish. And that is a disaster. No wonder our support base is collapsing. Right? No wonder. But we've got to get back to our ethical origins. How do we build that reciprocal obligations? Just one final thing before I seg into migration and asylum. How do we build those reciprocal obligations? We have to have a set of people on whom the reciprocity is defined. If you just think of it logically for a moment, reciprocity depends upon us saying, yeah, we are the people who accept that we have obligations to others and in return receive obligations from them. There's got to be a we. Now, the we can be defined on whatever we like that works, but it's got to be a genuine we. Right? The obvious way to do that is to build it on the identity of place. We all belong to the same place. At least I don't. Right? If King Canute had carried on in Britain, I'd be speaking Danish and I'd be one of you. Right? But he didn't. We got a Norwegian called William the Conqueror instead, and even he'd given up on Norwegian. So you've got to build a we based upon all belonging to the same place. Fortunately, that's very feasible because attachment to territory turns out to be an enormously powerful instinct. It's not even a human instinct. It's hardwired into all species for the last 4 million years. Now let me turn from the ethics of reciprocal obligations, which is the foundation of social democracy, but it's not the end of the ethics of social democracy. Alongside the ethics of reciprocal obligations, social democracy also quite rightly recognizes duties of rescue. This actually goes all the way back to Adam Smith, who did a very, very... There's the book, he did 2 books. One called The Wealth of Nations, which built economics. That was the book he thought was less important. Wealth of Nations was about people exchanging goods and getting better off. Right? The other book he wrote, which he thought was the more important, was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And that was about the exchange of obligations. And as he recognized, people actually get more gain from exchanging obligations than they do from exchanging goods. Right? And we can show from good psychological evidence now that people actually put more store on meeting their obligations than they do on consuming more goods. Right? The economic man is a complete travesty of what ordinary people are actually like. But alongside these reciprocal obligations, Smith recognized these duties of rescue to everybody. They're non-reciprocal. If somebody gets in a big enough mess, you help them, right? And the paradigmatic image of that is the child drowning in the pond. If you're there, you pull the child out of the pond. You don't say to the child, "What are you going to do for me?" or "Where are your parents?" And the child isn't screaming, "I demand my rights." The child's screaming, "Help," and we respond. That's the duty of rescue. Right? Now, my whole life for the last 40-plus years has been around meeting duties of rescue. My first book, The Bottom Billion, was about our duties of rescue to the poorest people in the world. My most recent book, Refuge, was about our duties of rescue towards refugees. So I'm much more invested in duties of rescue than in reciprocal obligations, though I am a product of what reciprocal obligations achieved, so I'm a passionate defender of them. Right? But let me now turn to these duties of rescue and what they amount to. And let's start with refugees. I got involved in refugees because the government of Jordan in 2015 sent for me. Basically they said, you seem to have ideas, we're in a mess, come. And normally, I believe economics is such a dangerous toolkit that I've had a rule all my life. I don't operate, as it were, out of area. If I know nothing about it, I don't go with my box of tricks. So I was about to say no, but Oxford University also has what's called the Centre for Refugee Studies, which is the main academic centre for the study of refugees in the world. And the director of that came to me and said, let's do this together. I know about refugees, you know about economic development, let's do it together. So we did. We found working together was so fruitful that that's why we ended up writing a book together, and we so enjoyed doing that that he's now persuaded we were going to write another book together, right? Not about refugees. But here's what happened. We got to Jordan, talked with the government. Government of Jordan had been hit by this huge refugee influx, about 1 million people. Small country. This is a small population country, not much bigger than Denmark. And basically, it had been left to cope pretty well on its own. What was Europe's response from 2011 right through to 2015? It was what I call the response of the heartless head. He said, thank goodness it's not our problem, it's yours. Right? Duties of rescue, nowhere in sight. Right? And so the government of Jordan was, by 2015, was really worried. Right? They'd been hit by this big economic burden. Their budget deficit had exploded. Their debt was rising rapidly. They were just needing ideas and help. So they did the usual things. They took us off to the biggest of the refugee camps. This was very old hat to Alex Betts. He's, done nothing but refugee camps, but it was a bit of a shock to me. Materially, the refugee camp was just fine. I mean, I'm used to African slums. By comparison, African slum, a refugee camp in Jordan was, kind of luxurious. But it was soul-destroying. I remember talking to a Syrian refugee family, and there they were. I said, I talked to a 16-year-old kid. I said, what do you do? You at school? No school. What do you do all day? Or just do housework. Well, the house was a porter cabin, You got a job? No, I'm not allowed to work. You got any brothers, sisters? Got a brother, 18. What's he doing? Oh, he's gone back to Syria. What's he doing in Syria? Don't ask, right? It's just which group is he fighting for, right? Got a sister? Don't ask, right? So, I went around the camp. I came across a little group of men who'd rigged a car engine into an electricity generator. And they were distributing electricity just around the local area. So I, being an economist, said, I'm afraid it sort of comes naturally to economists to say, how much do you charge for a kilowatt hour, right? And he looked at my UNHCR minder, and he said, looked very worried, he said, oh, no, we give it away for free. Because economic activity in that camp was kind of frowned upon, right? They weren't supposed to do that, right? And then our Jordanian hosts, they were bored with this. So they said, actually, we're a bit ahead of schedule. We could show you something that's really interesting. So off they said, it's only 15 minutes away. So we drove there. And this was indeed what the Jordanians were proud of, the King Abdullah Development Zone. They'd spent 100 million Jordanian pounds, which is a lot of money, on developing it. It was huge, fully equipped, electricity and everything, an industrial zone, and it was empty. Empty. Right? And it was 15 minutes away from a camp of 90,000 people with no work. Right? Now, fortunately, they brought in 2 Oxford professors, and so we used our amazing, superior intelligence to think, what could be done here, right? And, ordinary human mortals won't work this out, because they hadn't worked it out in 4 years, UNHCR, right? But it's, frankly, pretty obvious, isn't it? You've all got it, right? Why don't you create some jobs in the zone that the people in the camps can do, right? And so that became our strategy. Right? So we went back to the governor of Jordan and said, if we could bring in firms to create jobs, would you let the refugees work? Because at the moment, where we started was the Jordanians, very understandably, were terrified that there'd be a backlash if they let people work. In Syria, people were earning $2,000 a year, even before the conflict. In Jordan, they were earning $12,000. So Syrians thought they were in paradise if only they could get a job, any job, They could undercut Jordanians perfectly happily. That would have been a disaster. So our proposition was, no, if we bring in jobs and you share them between new jobs for Jordanians, new jobs for refugees, would you be prepared to do it? The government only took 6 weeks to think about that and decide, yeah, we'd do it, big time. You can have 70 refugee jobs for every 30 Jordanian jobs. And if you can bring them in, we'll go to 200,000 work permits. That's enough for a proper job for every refugee family. Right? So that was the plan. So then we used our network. I used to run the research at the World Bank, so I went to the bank and said, what about doing something? They said, you've forgotten the rules, Paul. Jordan's $12,000 per year per capita. We're out of Jordan. It's too rich for us to be anywhere near it. I said, 1 million refugees. Oh, we don't have that's UNHCR. So we went to UNHCR. I should say every individual worker for UNHCR, and it's got some very fine people, every single one of the staff we've talked to says, yes, go for it. The official response has been extreme indignation, saying, we're not a jobs agency. And that is indeed the problem. They're not a jobs agency. Their model is camps, free housing, free food, forever. And people don't want that. You know, this is kind of, as Alex says, this is the modernist vision of hell. Right? And so, globally, about 90% of refugees ignore everything that UNHCR has to offer. Because your first requirement, if you and your family are refugees, you want to try and re-establish some semblance of autonomy, and for that you need a job. And for that you need to go to town. And if you can't work legally, you go underground to the illegal economy, where you're at the mercy of crooks and gangsters, you know. But that's the reality. They'd rather do that than live in this soul-destroying environment of the camps. I mean, it was really quite extreme. I discovered that in this particular camp, there were 200 unemployed Syrian teachers, and there were thousands of Syrian kids who weren't being taught, because the only model at the moment is, oh, it's a Jordanian responsibility to provide teachers. Right? Well, that's bottom of the queue of Jordanian education needs. And what's more, when they come, they teach the Jordanian curriculum, and what the parents wanted was, you know, something, a semblance of normality. Can we just have the normal curriculum? I said to the bank, surely, you know, they said, oh no, if it's the refugees, it's UNHCR. I said, have you tried the board? So they did. They went to the board with a proposal, and the board of the World Bank is made up of executive directors, you know, Denmark will have one, and so on and so forth. And every single executive director on the board said, what a good idea, why haven't we been doing this before? And so straight away they approved $300 million to create jobs for refugees in Jordan. And now they've set up a whole department with $2 billion every 3 years to bring jobs to all the refugees in the haven countries. Most of the refugees in the world are concentrated in about 10 haven countries. The only thing these 10 have in common is that they're safe places in neighborhoods that are beset by various disorders. So then we went to Brussels and said, you know, what could you do to help Jordan? At the moment, you've got trade barriers against Jordan. Could you give it market access? And they thought about it and then said, okay, we can give 10 years free market access. So if a firm produces in Jordan, it can sell in Europe. Yeah? And then we approached the British Prime Minister of the time, David Cameron, and he put £1 billion into helping Jordan, and then forced the business minister for Britain to round up chief executives of big British businesses, fly them to Jordan, and say, find some opportunities here. And they did. You know, one of our biggest supermarkets is sourcing goods in Jordan on condition that, you know, 70% of the new jobs are refugee jobs. So that's if we'd been doing this for 20 or 30 years, European companies would have learnt by now how to make globalization work for refugees. There's a lot of activity which is relatively footloose. And you can take, German companies have created hundreds of thousands of jobs in Turkey over the years. Hundreds of thousands. They could have easily done this across the whole region. Instead, we had this, by mistake, the Chancellor Merkel sort of decision, it was almost a non-decision, which then escalated completely beyond what she'd expected. And it became a nightmare. if you're going to have refugees come to Europe, about the last country in Europe that's suitable for them is Germany, because Germany has perfected the process of skill acquisition in young people, these long periods of training followed by certification, and then followed by very high wages. And so refugees just cannot enter that world. They can't get jobs. At the moment, only about 14% of the refugees in Germany actually have jobs. Now, the next thing I'm going to say is why that is truly stunning, because the people who came to Germany were actually not, on the whole, the refugees who'd been in the camps. In fact, if you think about it, refugees are very much, they're the people who chose not to be migrants. They're the people who chose to stay in their homes, and then their homes became unsafe. And we see that in the refugees in Jordan, and indeed the refugees in Turkey, turn out to be a complete random sample of the Syrian population. Fear strikes anywhere, and where it strikes, people have to get out with their families. And so the demographics of the refugees in the neighborhood are identical to the demographics of the people staying in Syria. But if you look at the demographics of the Syrians who came to Germany, they're wildly different. This was highly selective in three respects. And incidentally, photographs can lie, because all the images, of course, of the photographers of the refugees on this trek find the emotive image, find the child in the arms of a woman, Well, actually, 70% were male. Most were young males. And they had to be affluent, because the only way you could get, the invitation to swim to Germany meant that you had to use a people smuggler. Remember, per capita income in Syria, annual per capita income, $2,000, even before the conflict. That was about what the people smugglers were charging. So, can you put your hands on your annual income in cash quickly? Probably not. Right? Who can? Who can? The affluent. Right? So you're pre-selecting young, male, affluent. But the most selective aspect was educational. So less than 5% of the Syrian population is in Germany, but Alex and I estimate that between a third and a half of all Syrians with university education are now in Germany. So inadvertently, Germany sucked the most highly educated out of Syria, and then it can't employ them. Right? But of course, they're desperate not to go back. Who will Syria need to rebuild it? The people with education. My sort of core speciality is post-conflict recovery. And it's not about concrete. It's about rebuilding organizations. You need educated people. So that was a switch from, I told you about the heartless head, just wash our hands of the whole process, which characterized 2011 to 2015, and then momentarily, Chancellor Merkel switched to the headless heart. Right? And for about 2 months, she was Saint Merkel, And then the German population got really angry and decided this was a big mistake. And so Chancellor Merkel switched completely and paid $3 billion to President Erdogan, and in return for his commitment that he'd take these people back, And so a 180-degree turn in German policy. I've actually been working very closely with the German government. I had a private dinner with Chancellor Merkel, but it wasn't about migration. It was about they'd been president of the G20, and they wanted, very commendably, they wanted an initiative on Africa. And that's my speciality. So they asked me if I would help design it, which I did. I was very proud of that, and I worked with Finance Minister Schäuble. We flew together to Africa, despite him being in a wheelchair. It was very heroic. And so we achieved quite a lot. And I also want to say that I will commend Chancellor Merkel both for doing something. I think she did the wrong thing, but she and David Cameron were the two leaders in Europe who actually tried to do something. They didn't just ignore it. And I commend her for not being petty and saying, that Collier is a pain in the neck, don't have anything to do with him. She said, oh, if he knows about Africa and we need to know about Africa, let's work with him. Not all global leaders are quite so open. Some seem to be a little bit petty at the moment, not naming any names. So that's the duty of rescue towards refugees. And in rethinking that, we need to use the heart, we need the compassion, and we need to use the head. These are complicated matters. Right? Not that complicated, right? You all got it in about 10 seconds, bring jobs, right? But we've got institutions, UNHCR, which are just ill-equipped to do that. They're the wrong agency. It's going to have to be agencies like the World Bank, which are now stepping up to it. World Bank, UNDP. And we got the wrong legal structure, this convention, which dates back from, basically, it was the opening shot of the Cold War in 1948. And it arose because in 1948, communist regimes were coming in Eastern Europe. They were persecuting the Democrats in Eastern Europe. The Democrats were fleeing to the West, and the Russians were saying, you know the rules, same as during 1945 with, it's a Hungarian soldier, you capture them, you send them back. If it's a Hungarian Democrat, you capture them, you send them back. And so the convention was designed to stop that. It said, no, we don't have to send them back. It was built around persecution. 98% of refugees nowadays are not persecuted as individuals. They're groups fleeing from disorder. State collapse, famine, whatever. At the time it was constructed, people recognized that the convention was very specific to place and circumstance. And so it was designed not to apply after January 1950, and it was only designed for Europe. And then in a classic, because I work on Africa, I've encountered over the last 40 years endless Eurocentrism. Right? Everything that Europe touches ends up being about Europe. Europe just asserts itself globally as whatever we think is the global norm. And so in a classic piece of Eurocentrism, in the 1960s, Europe decided that the convention was applied globally forever. It didn't consult the countries where the refugees actually were. Most of the countries that are havens for refugees are not actually signatories to the convention. Right? So we've got an agency which was designed for a totally different purpose. UNHCR persecuted East European Democrats, and a convention which was designed for a different purpose. And we've got a global problem. We've got 65 million displaced people in the world. That's about a post-1945 all-time high. This is not a problem that's going away. It's a problem that's going to stay with us and probably get bigger. Wearing a separate hat, I'm co-directing a commission on fragile states, state fragility. And state fragility is a real major problem globally that's not going to go away. It's a difficult problem to crack. So we need to prepare. So much for refugees. Let me finally turn to, more briefly, to our duty of rescue towards the global poor. This was my book, The Bottom Billion. It's been essentially what I've been working on all my life. And the countries that we need to focus on are the countries where people are in mass despair. So it's not a matter of head counts of poverty. It's a matter of societies where there isn't a credible prospect of prosperity. And where there isn't a credible prospect of prosperity, young people just despair, and the alternative to despair is get out. And that is a completely unviable solution to mass despair. Africa cannot empty, and if it did, it would be a tragedy. Right? Africa's societies have to catch up with us, and that is hard. But there is no alternative. We need efforts like what the Germans led with the compacts with Africa, practical efforts to bring firms and jobs and economic opportunities to Africa. And we need to do it big time. And it doesn't have to be just a flash in the pan. It's got to be a sustained effort over the next 20 years. Where does migration fit into this? Well, some migration can be helpful for catch-up. The migration that is really helpful for catch-up is when young Africans come to Europe, get educated, maybe get a little work experience, and then go back. We can show that that is a big force for catch-up. People who go back are very helpful. They bring not just skills, but new ideas, new ways of thinking. Yeah? And let's contrast that flow with what's really, really unhelpful. I've got a student at the moment, I just saw him last night, he's Sudanese, and he's a doctor. He's come to work as a graduate student with me because the Prime Minister of Sudan has offered him a job in the Prime Minister's office trying to help direct policy. And so he figured he'd better come and learn something that's not just medicine, you know. But for the last few years, he's been practicing as a doctor in the British National Health Service. So he's planning to go back. He tells me his friends think he's crazy. There are more Sudanese doctors practicing in London than in the whole of Sudan. Now, if we're universalist utilitarians or libertarians, we can celebrate that. Good for Sudanese doctors. If we're global economists and add up global GDP, if a Sudanese doctor leaves Sudan and becomes a taxi driver in London, global GDP goes up. It's efficient. That's what the market's telling us, right? It's also what the private incentives are telling the Sudanese doctors. That's why they come. Right? Is it a good thing, I ask you? Is it a good thing that there are more Sudanese doctors in London than in Sudan? Right? Is that the way we should be running our health system? Right? And what that breaches, I believe, is actually kind of the commandment, thou shalt not tempt. We are putting temptation in people's way, and it's not surprising when the temptations are huge that people take those temptations. It's no good criticizing them. We should criticize ourselves. Right? So, I'm going to draw to a close, but just one last set of remarks that return me to where I started, which is reciprocal obligations. Because that's been the vital heart of Social Democrat success and of the triumph of European societies post-war. Those of you who are old like me, if you think about your parents, my parents didn't grow up in a social democrat world. They grew up in the 20s and the 30s in the Depression. Life was really an anxious life. And social democracy, the reciprocal obligations transformed that. And that's what we need to get back to. Reciprocal obligations necessarily are defined on a boundary. The boundary of the people who understand and accept the reciprocity. And borders are those boundaries. They're the boundaries of reciprocity. What happens when we breach those boundaries? I'll close with a couple of bits of very new evidence. It was so new that it's post the book Exodus. Neither of them are generated by me. One is by a scholar called Rueda, and he's looked at, across Europe, what is the relationship between the willingness of what he's looking at is the willingness of those above median income to pay taxes to those below median income. How willing are people to do that? Right? Because the world of reciprocal obligations, people who are fortunate, like I've become, accept their obligations to help people who are not so fortunate. Right? But those obligations, that sense of obligation by the fortunate can be stressed, can be undermined, can be weakened. And what Rueda finds is that quite systematically across Europe, the higher the proportion of immigrants in the society, the lower the proportion of those above median income to be willing to pay taxes to those below median income. And so that's the threat. That's the threat. It's a tragedy, that, but it's there. And do we really want to undermine the fruits of reciprocal obligations? And clearly, we've got immigrants, we must make them welcome, we must make them feel included. That's the shared belonging of place. They have to get this sense of we are we. We're part of this web of reciprocal obligations, but that takes time to build. It doesn't automatically happen just as you cross a border and get a set of papers. Entitlements are not the same as accepting reciprocal obligations. And the final piece of evidence is much fancier than what Rueda did. Rueda was a sort of statistical relationship. But the latest social science is based upon behavioral experiments that are randomized. And so one of my colleagues in Oxford, though his work is quite unrelated to mine, but what he did was, he's Spanish, and so this is a study done in Spain. He gets two randomly sorted groups of people, as it were, everybody on that side of the room, everybody on that side of the room, and then he does what psychologists call priming. Priming is where you're introduced, some ideas are made more salient in your mind. So, people on this side of the room, you might get 15-minute talk on football. And people on that side of the room, you might get a 15-minute talk on immigration. Okay? And after that 15 minutes, he then asks these two random groups, how willing are you to pay taxes to people poorer than yourselves? Okay? And the football group turned out to be much more willing to pay taxes than the people who've been primed on migration. Right? So these are bitter realities, but they fit together, the evidence on the sort of randomized psychological experiments and the statistical relationship, that we're in danger of undermining the acceptance of reciprocity. We mustn't do that. And that suggests that immigrants really, really need to be integrated so that we get back to the big we. We can't afford oppositional identities. We can't afford to see immigrants as enemies, and immigrants can't afford to see our societies as an enemy. So they've got to get back to the big we. But that also suggests that the pace of immigration needs to be tailored to that objective. And we can monitor that objective by things like the acceptance of reciprocity. So that's how we should navigate on migration. But what we should always remember is that we do have this duty of rescue to bring hope, credible hope, to the societies which at the moment don't have it. Thank you very much.